is going to bring you that freedom. So I'm the person to follow in this regard.
But Toussaint at this time was addressing the wider world too. He was particularly focused on Spain.
The Spanish wanted to wrestle the colony away from France for two reasons. First, the colony was very, very prosperous in spite of the war. And second, that prosperity was used by the French Revolution to combat them in Europe.
Spain controlled Saint-Domingue's neighboring colony. So in June of 1793, Toussaint struck a deal. Spanish garrisons just over the border provided guns and ammunition to the slave army and tipped the balance their way. Toussaint's forces captured 3 cities within 8 months. Saint-Domingue's white planters were desperate. Many hated the new order in France. In a treasonous move, they invited the British to help put down the slave rebellion. Now, the empires of France, Spain, and England, along with a vast army of former slaves, were fighting for control of the small island colony. Then, in early 1794, events in Paris caused another explosion in the colony. A multiracial delegation from Saint-Domingue had appeared in France's National Assembly. They had been sent by Commissioner Sontonax with a dramatic message. He had pledged freedom to Saint-Domingue slaves for fighting the armies of Britain and Spain. The emissaries made a compelling argument.
These are the principles and the ideals of France, and we fully represent them, and we wish to continue to represent them on our island. And so we've come to present our arguments about why we are, in fact, truly committed to those ideas and principles, and how we epitomize these principles of the French Revolution.
I think it was very powerful for the representatives of France to hear essentially that what had happened in the Caribbean is that the white slave owners had deserted France. They had gone over to the British, they had fought against the Republic, and the true people, the true Republicans in Saint-Domingue were these enslaved people who just wanted their freedom.
The French National Assembly endorsed the emancipation of Saint-Dominguean slaves. But that was not all. The delegates freed slaves throughout the entire empire, too.
And there's rejoicing and celebration. There's an older woman, a free woman of color, who's traditionally gone to the debates, who sort of sheds tears and is brought down and celebrated as part of this moment. And there are speeches in Paris, celebrations of this event throughout France. It's really seen as a kind of triumph for the French Revolution, for the ideals of the French Revolution, that this worst form of hierarchy, enslavement, and oppression has been abolished in the Caribbean.
It was utterly unprecedented. In a stroke, nearly 1 million black slaves had become French citizens. Word that the French revolutionary government had freed its slaves reached Saint-Domingue quickly. It was one of history's great watersheds, and due largely to the extraordinary military accomplishments of Toussaint's army. But the credit did not rest with Toussaint alone. He had several able commanders working under him, men like Jean-Jacques Dessalines, who shared his soldiers' life experiences more closely than Toussaint.
Dessalines had been mistreated in slavery considerably, whipped a lot. He had tremendous whip scars on his back that he liked to display on occasion. He had deep reserves of anger and violence, but also a very intelligent man.
For Dessalines and Toussaint, emancipation changed everything. They quickly trimmed their sails to the new order.
Toussaint realized that Spain had a king, England had a king, and France was talking about liberty, equality, fraternity. All men equal. So he realized that although the revolt started by fighting the French right now could be the best help they could receive. So he rejoined the French.
After 3 years in opposition, Toussaint Louverture was once again a loyal French citizen. So were his followers. It tipped the balance. Before long, Toussaint, Dessalines, and the army of ex-slaves pushed the Spanish out of Saint-Domingue. The British soon followed. Word of Toussaint's astonishing string of victories against white armies was spreading across the European world.
They didn't like it. They didn't like it at all that there was a black general beating white armies. They didn't like it.
Slaveholders everywhere were stunned and worried.
In the United States, for instance, and in Cuba, they didn't want even white Frenchmen to come because they would tell the story. Why are you running away from Saint-Domingue? They would answer that, and no matter what they answer, it would be known that there was a black revolt.
We confronted dangers in order to gain our liberty, and we will be able to confront death in order to keep it. Slaves had once accepted their chain because they had not experienced a state happier than slavery. But those days are over. The people of Saint-Domingue would rather be buried in the ruin of their country than suffer the return of slavery.
Toussaint's ringing language showed his profound attachment to democratic ideals, but there was another side to Toussaint too.
Anybody who looked like they threatened Toussaint either ended up dead or deported.
Toussaint had already been appointed Brigadier General and then Governor of Saint-Domingue. No black man had ever risen so far in the colonies. But Toussaint had a rival. The beloved French civil commissioner, Félicité Sonthonax.
Sonthonax was extremely popular because he was the one to say, okay, slavery is abolished. He was very popular, and the blacks used to call him Papa Sonthonax. That didn't go well with Toussaint.
Toussaint is very friendly with Sonthonax as long as Sonthonax can serve his purposes. No, and nothing personal about it. When Sonthonax becomes useless, you will send him back over there. That's as simple as that.
And in 1797, Toussaint, in fact, no longer needed Sonthonax. In a series of political maneuvers, he isolated the civil commissioner. Then in August, he forced Sonthonax off the island. Toussaint Louverture had triumphed again. In 1798, as Toussaint Louverture was evicting the last of the British from his island, another French general battled British interest halfway around the world in Egypt. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte.
Well, Toussaint and Napoleon in many ways are similar. Both were a little bit from the margins of French society. They succeeded through military brilliance, and they're both incredible military leaders, and they became political leaders as a result of their military experience.
But Napoleon's victories would put Toussaint's at risk. Just months after conquering Egypt, Napoleon marched into Paris. A coup d'etat toppled the revolutionary government, and Napoleon took the reins of power. The revolution is over, he declared. I am the revolution.
As Napoleon is rising to power in France, Toussaint is watching closely about what's going on. He knows several things. He knows, first of all, that there are very powerful pro-slavery voices in France who are agitating against him, attacking him, and proposing that slavery actually be recreated in some form in Saint-Domingue.
Toussaint believes Saint-Domingue's survival and the survival of freedom itself depended on his ability to mobilize people to rebuild the devastated economy. And in Toussaint's mind, that meant one thing. His black followers should return to the cane fields.
There were some compelling reasons for this. I mean, mainly in Toussaint's situation, he was really in a bind at that point, in the sense that his hope for peace was restoring productivity on the plantations, recreating the sugar trade in particularly. But nobody wanted to go back to that kind of work, so he pretty well had to force them. And then the people began to think, this is a lot like slavery.
He was strong, maybe a little too strong with the blacks in several occasions, but he had to do it. He had to do it. To be a leader, you got to know where to lay back, and you have to know when to say, okay, guys, go ahead, let's do it. If you don't do it, hell, whatever the consequences, you'll pay for it.
Most newly freed slaves didn't see it that way. They wanted to work for themselves, growing crops for food rather than export. Toussaint's luster began to tarnish. Napoleon, on the other hand, was riding high. He restructured the government and proclaimed a new constitution for France. Far from enshrining black emancipation, it opened the door for France to reinstitute slavery in its colonies.
When Louverture heard that, he really understood that something was changing. And more ominously, he understood that he didn't have any way to influence Napoleon. And so what he did in kind of typical Toussaint fashion is he responded by saying, okay, Saint-Domingue is going to have its own laws. Well, here they are. I'm in charge here. I might as well write the Constitution.
Toussaint's constitution decreed slavery would never exist in Saint-Domingue again, and it was the first in history to prohibit discrimination based on skin color, a milestone that U.S. law would not guarantee for another 150 years. The Constitution had troubling elements too. It made Toussaint governor for life, with sole authority to designate his successor.
Toussaint's a great hero to me, but this was not a good idea. I mean, he basically, with that gesture, installed permanent military dictatorship, which has remained a problem in Haiti for 2 centuries. He could have done what he needed to do without that, I think. I'm not quite sure why he did it. But that was enough to send Napoleon over the edge.
Napoleon Bonaparte had had enough of revolution, and according to Napoleon, the U.S. President, Thomas Jefferson, shared his view.
The prospect of a black republic is equally disturbing to the Spanish, the English, and the Americans. Jefferson has promised that at the instant the French army has arrived, all measures will be taken to starve Toussaint. Rid us of these gilded Negroes, and we will have nothing more to wish for.
Toussaint tried urgently to show Napoleon that military logic, if nothing else, proved the merit of black ambitions.
Toussaint was writing Napoleon. He wanted so much to be recognized as saving this land for France.
His efforts failed. In 1802, Toussaint was stunned to see the largest French expeditionary force ever assembled entering Saint-Domingue's harbor. Its mission was simple. Napoleon wanted to turn back the clock.
My decision to destroy the authority of the blacks in Saint-Domingue is not so much based on consideration of commerce and money, as on the need to block forever the march of the blacks in the world.
Toussaint Louverture fought the invading French army for 3 grueling months, but the island's black population, now disenchanted with his leadership, offered lackluster support. On May 6, 1802, Toussaint Louverture surrendered. At first, he was allowed to retire from the army with full honors. But a month later, he was called to a meeting with the French commander.
If I wanted to count all the services that I have rendered to the French government, I will need several volumes, and still I wouldn't finish it all.
Toussaint was arrested on charges of conspiracy.
He wrote some stuff that's very eloquent, saying, I rather suspect that it's because of my color that you're treating me like a common criminal, although I prefer not to believe this.
And to compensate me for all the services, they arrested me arbitrarily in Saint-Domingue. They choked me and dragged me like a criminal without any decorum or concern for my rank. Is that the recompense due my work?
Normally, a mutinous French officer would have been brought before a military tribunal, so he comports himself as if he's going to have a military trial.
Toussaint's sons had been educated in France. They had even met Napoleon. Hoping again that Napoleon would understand his thinking, Toussaint peacefully